So hello and welcome to the 7 Steps to a Native Plant Garden by Jackson County Library Services and the Jackson County Master Gardener Association. I am Carrie Tannehill, Interim Branch Manager. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone, and if you want, you can turn off your camera so we can get a quality recording. There will be a time at the end for Lynn to answer your questions, and if you want to put them in the chat while you think of them during your presentation, that's totally fine, or you can ask her directly at the end. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Tallamy, Alachua people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org.land. So the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. Today's presenter is Lynn. How do you pronounce your last name? I forgot to ask. Kunstman. Lynn Kunstman is with us today. Thank you. She has a degree in wildlife management from Humboldt State University and a master's in science education from Southern Oregon University. So thank you so much for being with us here today, Lynn, and I will give it over to you to start your presentation.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm trying to see if I can even see myself talking there. I like this quote from Helen Keller, which just went away because I clicked. The idea that we obviously can't do everything to save the world or save whatever it is we're concerned about, but we can do one thing, and that we need to make those kinds of choices. So the presentation today is about saving nature 1 yard at a time. And it is based on the work by Dr. Douglas W. Tallamy from the University of Delaware. If you're not aware of his work, he has several books out, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, The Nature of Oaks. He is an entomologist and an ecologist at the university there, and speaks all over the country to organizations about the ecological disasters that are facing us and how we as property owners can have a part in restoring nature and restoring ecological balance in our local communities. So with that in mind, and special thanks to Tom Landis and Susie Savoy for a lot of the photos that I've used here. So this presentation, I can send you a PDF of it in 2 parts if you're interested at the end. This is Dr. Tallamy's second book, Nature's Best Hope, and it's basically what this program is kind of based on. And this is a link to one of his YouTube presentations called Hope for the Wild, which you can watch in a little more depth and if you're interested once I get done talking today. He's a very good presenter. He'll become your favorite college professor all over again. So basically, we are facing an ecological crisis. Our food webs are sort of collapsing, and there's a why should we be concerned? Well, there is an insect apocalypse going on right now, and that means that like 45% of insects worldwide are in decline or have gone extinct. That's a worldwide decline, not just in the U.S. Loss of native habitat. Obviously, we're all aware of the things that are going on that take away the habitat that nature requires. Loss of birds and other wildlife. And the drivers of the loss are things like industrial agriculture, which mows road to road or fence line to fence line without leaving any kind of protective vegetation on the edges. roads and their hazards, obviously, wildlife trying to cross roads. So not only have we paved the environment, then we've made it hazardous for them to travel through it. Unnecessary lights, and this is something that everybody can take care of at home. And then tens of millions of acres of sterile lawn in the US. A shocking amount of lawn is in cultivation, and it's a non-native. And then widespread destruction and displacement of our native plants. So as we wipe out natural systems, we're replacing them with unnatural systems. So we can't survive without the insects that support all of the food webs. So the native plants support the insects. The insects are the next part of that food web. Without the insects, none of us are going to survive. And we need their pollination services as well. These are honeybees. They are an introduced non-native species to the US. They're from the European continent. And then these are some of our native bees. We have something like 1,400 species of native bees in North America. So how can we turn this around? Well, as we go through the slideshow, I'm going to be showing you some insects and some plants. This is an Apollo butterfly nectaring on one of our natives, horse mint, Augustaceae reticifolia. And you'll see sometimes one of these pink labels in parentheses, a number. That means how many insect species that plant will host. In other words, how many insect species lay their eggs in that plant. Now, this is an old slide presentation, and I'm guessing this is an incorrect number at this point. I'm guessing there are more than one species that lay their eggs on Augustaceae. So the good news is we can reverse the insect decline and save our beautiful birds. Birds are probably suffering the most with this at this point. By making our yards and public spaces look like this instead of like this. So these landscapes that we see that are manicured and look, like Versailles, or, here you have a sterile lawn and balls and boxes of non-native plants. Those are providing no ecosystem services for our native insects. They can't utilize those. And if the insects can't use them, then the birds can't come and feed on the insects. So here's a better plant to put out in your yard if you're planting shrubs. This is red flowering currant, Ribes sanguineum. It blooms April and February. It's early blooming and beloved of our native bees and birds. You can focus on the land that's easiest for you to fix, your own yard, right? Your own property. Don't try and go out and change the world. Just work on your yard. So insects, all insects, have to specialize on eating native plants. If they're European insects, they're going to be eating European plants. In North America, they need North American native plants. And so if we don't plant those plants, we're not going to be growing the things that the insects need. 90% of insects that eat plants can develop only and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. Here's an example of a very specific, not unlike the monarch, where there is one plant that hosts this particular butterfly. This is the pipevine, the California pipevine, and this is the California pipevine swallowtail. Without this plant, this butterfly cannot exist. She has to lay her eggs on this plant. Her young can't eat anything but that. So if you don't have California pipevine in your yard, you're not going to have this lovely blue butterfly. Okay, so native plants have adapted to their hungry caterpillars. And there are 7 steps I'm going to take you through today to make a difference and help save nature in your own yard, or maybe in your neighborhood if you really want to get the neighbors on board. Here's the most controversial one for everybody. Step 1, remove at least half your lawn. Lawns are introduced species. They do not support native insects. They don't build or protect the soil. They waste and pollute water because we overwater them. And we put chemicals on them that then run and leach into the streams and kill off the insect life in the streams. They pollute the air because we're out there with gas mowers and leaf blowers, and they are kind of a nightmare. So here is just some statistics about lawns. In this country, we have 45 million acres of lawn, 2 billion gallons of gas we use every year for lawn equipment. 41 billion pounds of carbon dioxide is pumped into the air, 13 billion pounds of toxic and carcinogenic air pollutants emitted from the leaf blowers and mowers. Those two-cycle engines do not have catalytic converters, so they're actually far more polluting than cars. 100 million pounds of pernicious lawn chemicals, because people buy lawn chemicals and throw them out there helter-skelter, and fertilizers, and then 9 billion gallons of water a day. And then you repeat that every year. It's a nightmare. Better to maybe leave some of your yard, your lawn area to grow into meadow like this. And particularly back east where people have large acreage and they're mowing it all. They should leave some of it with walkways cut through, but with flowers. Or like this. This is a very nice planting of a lot of native species here. And the reason for reconsidering lawns, and I understand that people are attached to their lawns, and you want to have a place for the kids to play and the dog to run and poop and those kinds of things. And that's okay. But think about taking out half of it, because look at the root system on your lawn. Here it is with the purple arrow. If you replace that with native herbaceous plants, such as these grasses and forbs, look at these root systems. Some of them are 15 or more feet long. When roots go down that deep, they help water go deeply into the soil. They are storing carbon in all of this root system. They are actually pulling carbon out of the air and putting it in the soil where it will stay for 1,000 years. Lawns will not do that for us. All of our native plants will. So something to think about. All right, this is why you don't have to water native plants. Those are, the roots are acting like sponges, and you can see the scale of these root systems in this live museum example here. So by removing just half your lawn, just half. We're not asking everybody to take everything out, although I would argue that isn't a bad idea if you're willing. If we only take out half the lawns, let's say 20 million acres of lawn, we can add more native acreage than Everglades, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Mount Rainier, Grand Teton National Canyonlands, North Cascade Badlands, Olympic Sequoia, Denali, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Parks combined. So we have over twice the acreage in lawn in this country than we have in national parks. We need to be thinking about that. Okay, so let's say your lawn, right now your house looks like this. It's got a big lawn around it, a few specimen trees, and your lawn looks maybe like that. We would like you to have it start to look like this. More vegetation, more cover for animals, more bird feeders. Those are, when you plant plants, they're bird feeders. And if you get your neighbors on board, then your neighborhood becomes an ecosystem that can support breeding populations of birds. And that's what we want. Step 2. So step 2 in the process, number 1 is take out the lawn. Step 2 is remove as much as possible non-native and invasive plants. This is a link to the Garden Smart Oregon, a guide to invasive plants and some substitutes to plant instead of them, to non-invasive plants that you can put in your yard. Because things like fennel, which I grow in my garden because I want fennel for flavoring, but I make sure the seeds don't get loose because this will get out in the environment. So fennel is extremely invasive. It's on our noxious weed list in Oregon. as is this plant, the butterfly bush, which most of you have seen before, and many of you have in your yards. It is non-native, it is invasive, it provides no food for insects, no hosting for insects, and this is some butterfly bush that's out in the Kalmiopsis wilderness, because guess what? Birds eat the seeds of this, and then they fly away and poop it out somewhere else, and now we've got things that can't be good for the environment out there in the environment. All of you who've been to Portland know what the Portland forests look like. Here's all the English ivy that's escaped from the yards in Portland, and it's choking the trees in the forest. Here's English laurel, also growing on the forest floor in Portland. And then when you get out in sunnier spots, we've got Scotch broom and pampas grass. You know, the list goes on and on. It's a really awful situation. So when you go to the nursery, in the past, if you were like me, I went to the nursery and I looked for decorative value. I was looking for eye candy for Lynn. I was looking for a plant to screen my neighbors off, or, you know, the street. I was looking for a focal point, something pretty to put in the front yard, or an anchor, something to anchor whatever I was doing in the yard. These are all great, but these are human desires here. And we have to think beyond our own desires to the criteria when we're choosing plants for our landscapes. So we'll get back to that in a minute. That's gonna show up again a little more balanced next time. This is so step 3 in the process, after you've removed part of the lawn and you've taken out some of your invasives. Then you're going to start planting native plants. So this is it's called mock orange. It's not the mock orange that the nurseries sell. That's an Asian species. Don't use the common name. Always choose your plants based on the scientific name. Philadelphus lewisii. It's a lovely bush, and it has a beautiful fragrance of oranges. So it's a wonderful landscape bush. So you could choose that instead. And now you've got not just the decorative value, the focal point, all that stuff. You've taken care of all these ecosystem services, food web value. It's growing caterpillars that birds can come in and hunt and feed to their young. Pollinator habitat, our native insects and bees will come to this to feed and gather pollen. Watershed value, those deep roots are going to percolate the water down into the water table. You get to watch wildlife in your yard. It's sequestering carbon in the root systems. It's restoring the soil, and it's moderating the weather in your yard. So plant choice really matters. It really matters. And we want this balance. All right, so there are those native plants build soil and hold it. Soil restoration and carbon sequestration, again, those roots. There's the agricultural crop versus the native crop. So they provide food for native insects, and we've talked about 90% of our insects have to feed on native plants. Here's a sphinx moth nectaring on our native lily, camas lily, great camas. So they're pretty plants. Native caterpillars have to eat native plants. This is red twig dogwood, and it hosts 54 different species of moth and butterfly. When we talk about planting milkweed that everybody wants to plant for the monarch, that's great, but you're going to get one species there. You're going to get monarchs, and we're glad you're doing that. But if you plant dogwood as well, then there are 54 other species of moth and butterfly that will lay their eggs there, and that the birds can come and pull caterpillars off of to feed their young. And why are caterpillars so important? Because most of our bird groups in North America have to feed their nestlings caterpillars. So those are things like titmice and bush chits and chickadees, these little guys. They're very, very tiny. They weigh less than 4 pennies. They're itty bitty birds. So they're acrobatic foragers, and they forage in the branches of, guess what, trees and shrubs. So you're thinking of putting in a butterfly garden, but if you're thinking about birds, you need to put in trees and shrubs for them. They're mixed flocks, and they come together. All those little guys come together in guilds called cleaning guilds, and they're plucking insects and caterpillars out of your vegetation and eating them. They are little insect eaters. They're gleaning those insects for food. So here's a chickadee, just as an example of a little bird. He weighs 0.35 ounces. That's about 4 pennies worth. And for that chickadee to successfully pull off a clutch of eggs with its mate, they have to gather between 6,200 and 9,000, depending on how many babies in the nest, caterpillars to feed those babies just to get them out of the nest. Then the parents feed them for another 2 weeks out in the vegetation. So these little guys have to work from dawn to dusk every single day, bringing caterpillars to their young. If you want to have chickadees and you want to have breeding chickadees, you need to grow the trees and shrubs that grow the caterpillars that they have to feed their young. And why caterpillars? Well, come on, Lynn. Okay, what's the big deal with caterpillars? Well, could be because they're beautiful, and they are. We know they're really interesting looking. Could be because they have really cool names, like Painted Lady and Batis Philonor. That's that pipevine swallowtail caterpillar that I showed you before, the blue pipevine swallowtail. Anyway, they've got great names. They've got great looks, but really it's because they are soft. They are large, they are high in protein, they are high in lipids, fats, which helps the little baby birds put on weight. They're a best source of carotenoids, which gives the baby birds good, strong eyes and feather color. And they're really easy to stuff down a baby bird throat. It's like putting a big old bratwurst down your baby's throat. And there can't be any chickadees where there are not enough caterpillars. They'll try to feed seed to their young, and the babies will die in the nest. So they have to. We want more than chickadees. We want most other birds that we see in our gardens are much bigger than chickadees, right? Warblers are bigger, our native warblers. And they glean insects off branches of trees and shrubs. This is coffeeberry. It hosts 21 species of caterpillar, moth, and butterfly babies, right? Thrushes, robins, those are pretty robust birds. Bluebirds. Also, they hunt in the leaf litter and in trees and shrubs. So leaf litter is a critical habitat for these birds to forage through. Woodpeckers really getting bigger now, and these are all our native western woodpeckers. And they drill into tree trunks and branches and capture insects under the bark. The acorn woodpeckers gather and store their acorns in those granary trees that you've seen sometimes when you're out hiking. And then woodpeckers can also fly catch. Wrens are they forage in dense vegetation all the way from the ground up into the high canopy, 80-foot trees. Jays, vireos. We want all of these birds to be healthy and have reproducing populations. So those groups forage from the ground to the treetops, all up and down this vertical environment that you need to be thinking about. People think about putting in a butterfly garden because they want the butterflies to come through, so they just put in flowers for the adults. You better be thinking about the whole life cycle. You need to grow the caterpillars that make the butterflies. And to do that, you need vertical as well as horizontal plantings to maximize foraging opportunities for your birds. So flycatchers, they need sort of meadow scapes. They sit up high and they fly out and capture birds or insects on the wing. So things like mosquitoes or other things that you might not want to have in your yard, those birds eat those. So plant choice matters. Plant choice matters. So here are some examples. Here's serviceberry, our native serviceberry. It hosts 81 different species of moth and butterfly. And we're adding caterpillars to the landscape by adding the native plants that make them. Here's deerbrush, which is a different plant family than the serviceberry, and it hosts 93 different species of caterpillar and moth. And a lot of those are going to be different from the ones that were hosted here. Willow, Willow is one of our keystone plants in the Western US, hosting over 300 species of moth and caterpillar, as well as many of our native, it provides early pollen for our native bees. So a keystone plant is a plant that is highly productive and produces many different types of insect for wildlife populations. This is our native white oak. So just a quick study that Dr. Tallamy did on a 14-year-old white oak in his yard. He counted 410 caterpillars in 19 different species. So, and that was just a small tree at breast height. He wasn't climbing ladders or anything like that. All of these different types of caterpillar. So huge amounts of bird feed in that one tree. Here's a black cherry. We have these, this is Prunus virginiana, and the caterpillars on the black cherry, 239 different species of caterpillar in that particular tree. So our Western cherries, we have 3 of them. We have a bitter cherry, a choke cherry, and a Klamath plum. They're all Prunus, the genus Prunus, which is what this 240 species of moth and butterfly are looking for. So they can lay in Prunus marginata or Prunus virginiana or Prunus subcordata. Any of those would work. And these are small trees that actually work okay in small yards. Here's Prunus marginata. That's what it looks like. It's got nice bark and flowers and berries. There's Prunus virginiana, and attracts several different kinds of butterfly and moth. Cool panicles of flowers, nice fall color. And this is what the Klamath plum looks like. And you can actually make jams and jellies out of those plums. So here's a Bradford pear. It's a non-native, and you know that these are growing all over Medford and up on campus at the college, and they do nothing. Caterpillars on a Bradford pear, 11 caterpillars, 1 species. These basically are sterilizing this entire environment here. Not only that, once again, the birds eat these fruits. They were supposed to be sterile plants made by the nursery trade. They were touted as not having any fruit, and so they wouldn't, be a problem. People wouldn't have to clean up the fruit. Well, the birds found the little fruits that they did make, flew them around, and now they are the most invasive species on the eastern seaboard. This is a really difficult, they're taking over native areas. So instead of planting a Bradford pear, please consider growing a black hawthorn, Crataegus douglasii. It has beautiful bark, it has lovely flowers, and fruit for cedar waxwings in the fall. 80 species of caterpillar will grow on that. Here's burning bush. It's an invasive non-native species in Oregon. Caterpillars on burning bush, well, 1 type, 1 species, 44 caterpillars. Once again, it's doing nothing for our native food webs. So if you add caterpillars to suburban ecosystems by planting native vegetation, you will be breeding birds. And that's the idea. You don't just want birds, you want birds with nests with successful rearing of young. You don't need to rip out all of your non-native plants. I grow a mix of non-native and native because I grow food. And my backyard is a food garden. My front yard is a pollinator garden. And all of our food plants, almost all our food plants are non-native. So the non-natives that I grow are things like spruce and English walnut, pecan, pawpaw. Actually, pawpaw is a North American native, but east of the Rockies. I've taken out the butterfly bush. I've taken out the fennel because we talked about them being invasive. Pineapple guava, daylilies, all of these are non-native plants that I grow in my yard. And then these are some of the natives. I've got more than this now, but we have natives of all of these things: goldenrod, and 2 kinds of milkweed, California fuchsia, asters, buckwheat, different kinds of currants, lupin and penstemon and huckleberry and the California pipevine, which grows very well here in a shaded spot. So making insects supports life. This is deerbrush, once again, 93 species hosted, and there are some of them. That's what some of those little butterflies look like once they go through their life cycle. Swallowtails, and blues, and hair streaks and tortoiseshells. Lots of different little beauties if you put this in your yard. So diversity of core genera, got this thing that keeps keystone native plants is key to Southern Oregon. If you are growing a willow, you're going to get about 312 species, around 300 species of different insects laying their eggs on that plant. And you won't know it when you look at the plant. The plant will look completely healthy. Use the 10-step plan, the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from the plant and see if you're worried about the insect damage that's going on it. You won't be. If you then add a cherry to that, now you've added 239 more species of insects. So now your count is up to 552 species of little critter that you're growing for the birds. Add a poplar, if you've got a big property, add, a cottonwood, something like that. Now you've got even more things that the birds can eat. Add an alder, add an oak, add a pine. If you've got big property, be putting in those bigger trees. Add a blueberry, a caneberry, which is rubus, ceanothus. You can have up to 1,900 different species of caterpillar in your yard. And that will give the birds quite a little smorgasbord to choose from. So remember, when you plant a plant, you're planting a bird feeder. So the willow, your bird feeder's full. Good on you. You put in some kind of a willow in your yard, and it's not the weeping willow from Asia. You want to put in a native willow, if not a Western native, at least a North American native. Then our generalist caterpillars will be able to find it. Your bird feeder's full. So native prunus, we talked about all the caterpillars. Nandina, this is something that's in everybody's yard in Medford, at least where I live. It's in almost every yard in my neighborhood because it's pretty. It's green all year. It's got red berries during Christmas. It's really pretty. And the berries are deadly to cedar waxwings because of the way cedar waxwings feed. They come through in feeding flocks. A robin will come through, eat 10 berries and fly away and be fine. But these berries contain cyanide. And when the cedar waxwings come, they eat until they can't eat anymore. They gorge and they strip a bush. And so if they encounter this, chances are many of them will die if they come in and strip an Andina. So Audubon is asking people to remove those and plant something native. This is a non-native Pieris japonica. It doesn't help in any way. It's pretty. We know it's lovely, but it's not supporting any ecosystem services. Native viburnum is much as lovely, I think. It's got lovely fall color and berries. And when you put it in, 31 species of insect can live in there, and that means the birds have food. So choose a native when you can. Remember, plant choice matters. Here's our native Oregon grape, our state flower. It's a lovely holly-looking plant and an early bloomer, really important early bloomer. So plant choice matters. If you want to find plants that will work in your neighborhood, you can Google Native Plant Finder, this link here, and it will take you to the National Wildlife Federation. You put in your zip code and it will come up with the best plants for you to plant in your area. All right, we're at step 4 here. So avoid or minimize the use of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. I know this looks pretty grim. I put the Grim Reaper there, the little pirate skull and crossbones, but sometimes it is necessary to use something, but it's really important that if you are going to choose one of these products, you read and follow the label instructions to the letter. And I really encourage people not to use these. If you have a healthy yard, with native plants, they require fewer of these things. They are in balance with the, the soil organisms and the local insects. Shouldn't be needing this. If you're growing natives, you'll need far fewer and hopefully none of them. We've seen all of these on the shelf in all the stores and nurseries. And when you ask the nursery people, what do I do? But for the black spots on my roses, they're going to give you a 3-in-1 systemic product that's going to get up into the tissues of that plant. And so that's problematic. We know that when we spray something on vegetation, it isn't just taken up by the plant tissues itself. It moves into the soil. It affects the soil biota, meaning the living things in the soil. And then 90% of it gets into the soil. Basically, it runs down the plant, and it's only about 2% of it gets taken up by the plant. It then leaches through rainwater or lawn watering into the aquifer and then into the surface waters where it kills the aquatic insects. And aquatic insects are probably the most endangered insect types on the planet. So in some streams, we have lost 98% of the insects that would normally be in the streams. So it's a very scary situation there, because if you like fish, or you think streams need to be healthy, they've got to have these invertebrates for food for everything that lives there in the river. Then it's taken up by birds who are eating the seeds. It's running off into the streams. It's getting the non-target insects. It's kind of a nightmare. So we really encourage people not to use those products if possible. Here's another nice native that likes kind of a wet site. Or at least a water table that's pretty shallow. So if you're living in an area where the neighborhood is draining through your yard, you could plant Douglas spirea and grow 54 species of caterpillars. So when you choose native plants for your yard, you're focusing on 2 groups of insects. The caterpillars, which check we've already talked about, and I've been harping on those for a while. But then the other group of insects you need to think about are pollinators, and those are bees and some of our adult butterflies and moths and a lot of our fly species. We have many flies that are pollinators, and wasps as well. So lots of different things are pollinators, hummingbirds and bats and other things. So step 5 then is for you to build a pollinator garden, and this is more like what people think of as a, quote, butterfly garden. This is where you're going to see things flying in and utilizing flowering plants to collect pollen and nectar. Bees are going to be using that. So this is our native pearly everlasting, pretty gray foliage and a nice white flower. But I want to show you real quickly a little video which compares how we see the world and the flowers we're planting in our yards, and how insects see them when they come through, because insects are seeing in the ultraviolet spectrum, and they're seeing things very differently from what we see. So the first thing you see is human vision. The second image is butterfly vision. The third image of the same flower is bee vision. Look at how different these things look to a butterfly and a bee than they do to your eye. I am not going to belabor the point, but you get the idea. When a bee is flying over your garden, over a floral resource, it is seeing things much differently. And the reason most of our native flowers are white, yellow, and lavender or blue, it's because they have adapted to the sight and vision of the bees and other insects that are flying to them to provide the pollinating services they need. So who are our major pollinators? Well, we have one species of honeybee. It's not native. We have 4,000 species of native bees in North America. And in fact, the honeybees are, there's a lot of new evidence, scientific evidence that honeybees are endangering our native bees by outcompeting them in some instances. And then we have 14,000 species of moth and butterfly. So you can see the variety of bees and butterflies here. This is a wasp, a thread-waisted wasp. This is another little, this is actually some kind of little wasp. And then there are some little native bees. Here's the little green sweat bee and one of our little native, probably a little checker butterfly. So bees are critical for pollination needs, so we want to plan for them. You can plant huckleberries. Huckleberries are a great native plant, evergreen, beautiful, delicious berries. Somebody asked about edible foods, edible wild foods. Huckleberries are it, baby. Boy, there's nothing like huckleberry pancakes. Yeah, so most productive native plant genre for native bees. And these are native bee specialists. These are specialists that can only come to goldenrod. We have 11 species of bees that can only forage the pollen and nectar from goldenrod. So if you don't have goldenrod in your yard, you're not going to get that 11 species of bee. Willows have 8 species of specialist bees that will forage nowhere else but on our native willows. Same with our native asters. These all have a suite of native specialist bees that can't eat anywhere else. Sunflower bees have to have native sunflowers. So if you plant these flowers for these specialist bees, the generalist bees will utilize it. So 40 species of specialist bees on just 7 varieties of plant. If you can find these and put them in your yard, you'll get 40 species of these little native bees coming into your yard. And when you plant for them, the generalists will come too. The bumblebees will come, even the honeybees will come to those plants. Here's our West Coast Canada goldenrod. Just a critical keystone plant for native and honeybees, and they provision their nests with the pollen and nectar from these plants. Monarch butterflies need goldenrod when they're migrating, and this is the migration time of the year right now. They're coming through the valley and they're looking for goldenrod because it provides so much fat for their for them to store to make the 40 miles a day trip that they do. They fly 40 miles a day going south. So they've got to bulk up. So you want to think about, when you're planning a pollinator garden, you want to think about plant families. So one of those families is the carrot family. The Apiaceae, which is Apia is bee. It's the bee family of plants. And those are things like dill and fennel and coriander and parsley we grow in our gardens. And the native ones are our lomatium and our angelica. Lots of tiny, tiny, tiny flowers, and they will provide pollen and nectar for our little parasitic wasps, our predatory wasps, and our little fairy bees and perdita bees that are like the size of a grain of rice. The mustard family, very, very important for smaller bees who have smaller mouth parts and need a smaller flower. Rockcress, alyssum, broccoli, cauliflower, these things we grow in our food gardens. And then we have wallflowers and cresses out there in the landscape as native plants. The aster family, incredibly important for fall for fall foraging for our bees and our migrating butterflies. So yarrows, daisies, madia, the tarweeds. This is our native annual sunflower, Pollinator sunflower for our little longhorn bees. And this is Douglas aster. Once again, a late blooming. It blooms all the way into November for anything that's flying south and needs a place to get a drink. The mint family, so anything like thyme, oregano, catnip, basil, mint, and then our horse mints, our monardella, our coyote mints, our sages and salvia that are out there on the hillsides. Very, very important family for pollinators. Bunch grasses. People don't think about grasses. Grasses are really, really important because a lot of our little butterflies overwinter in these grass bunches. They go into those and they need those for insulation. And some of the larvae actually feed on these grasses. So here are some of our native grasses, and we grow some of those in the nursery. And you'll be able to get some of those at the plant sale coming up on October 9th. So choose a native plant if it can work in your yard. Always when you go to the nursery, think, okay, is there a native I can use here? Rather than just picking the first thing that looks good to you. Try and make that choice. And you need to avoid things, we call them nativars and cultivars. Nativars, so this is the native Echinacea purpurea. By the way, it's native to the eastern United States, not here in the West, but it will work in a landscape if you put it in. The generalist bees and butterflies will come to it. This is a good choice for butterflies. This is not. The reason this is sterile is because this elaboration here, this doubling of the flower, is really just taking all of this pollen and nectar away. It's that now that flower is not producing pollen and nectar, it's just making eye candy for you. So it's worthless to the insect life that you're trying to promote. This is a native elderberry. This is the one you want to choose. This cultivar is a purple foliage variety. That change in foliage color, the insects won't recognize it as this plant because it has too many anthocyanins in it, and the insects haven't adapted to dealing with that color, the chemicals that make that color in the plant. So always choose the native plant. When you see the term nativar, what it means is there's a variety of plant that's been found out in nature that maybe is shorter or has a slightly different bloom color, or maybe is variegated, and people have taken cuttings of that and cloned it, and they're making copies of it over and over and over again. So Coffeeberry Eve case is a good example of that the nurseries are all selling because it's a small coffeeberry. It doesn't get real big, and people can kind of contain it in their small yards. So it is a naturally occurring plant, but it's being made copies of over and over and over again, which takes away some of our diversity. So different flower color than the native plant you want to avoid. You want to avoid different leaf color than the native plant, and you want to avoid double flowers. So pollinators need plants that bloom over a long period of time, and you need to choose a variety of blooming annuals, perennials, ground covers, herbs, shrubs, and trees that bloom across all seasons. And remember, oaks and maples and willows all bloom, and they provide pollen and nectar. So it's important to remember trees and shrubs. We need to plan food and nesting opportunities for our bees. This is Western Golden Top. And what bees need to reproduce are pollen and nectar. So here she is gathering pollen to take back to her nest, wherever that is. And we have 1,600 species of native Northwest bees. And they're better than the honeybees for pollination services. They're about 95% more efficient at pollinating than honeybees are. And native bees nest in the ground. They nest in woody stems. They nest in pithy stems. They nest in hollow stems. And this is an example what a pithy stem would look like. And a bee might drill a hole in there and lay her eggs and put down a pollen loaf. Here's woody stems. So these are mason bees have plugged these up. They've laid eggs and put down a bee loaf. A bee loaf is just a combination of pollen and honey or nectar that the bee gathers up together and makes a sticky ball, lays her egg in that. And then her larva will feed on that after she seals it into this chamber. So here are some different bees. This is the mason bee with the mud nest that she makes. The walls in her nest are mud. She'll lay like 9 to 12 little eggs on little pollen balls in a tube, in a tube or a stem, and then she'll seal it up with mud. Leaf cutter bees, you've seen these. When you see this kind of a cut on a leaf in your yard, you don't freak out and get out the bug spray. That's a leaf cutter bee, and she is gathering stuff to do this, to make her little chambers for her young. And that's a good thing. When you see that, you do a happy dance. She's cutting out the leaves to make a nest. She'll do it on your roses too. She'll make it out of petals. This is a resin bee. It collects the wax off of the flowers or foliage surfaces of plants. Mason bee use mud. And then the wool carder bees actually pulls the fuzz off of plants and makes these divisions with a packing of wool, like a toe shoe for a ballerina. All right. Most of our bees nest in the ground. Bumblebees certainly do. And so you need to leave some open space in your garden. Here's what my garden kind of used to look like in June. I'm changing it up a little bit now. There's a bunch of non-natives in there that I'm kind of removing, but and then this is what it looks like in October. You can see it looks kind of rangy and wild. And I leave that all up over the winter because the bees are using those stems. So I don't do garden cleanup until March, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So a lot of people like to put these bee hotels out in their yards, insect hotels, and they look great. But if you don't maintain them and clean them out every single year, they concentrate disease and predators and parasites. And the commercial bee houses, please don't buy the commercial bee houses where you can't remove the tubes, because you see these little things on the back of this bee? Those are hairy-footed pollen mites on a mason bee. And she is just covered with them, even under her wings down here. That bee is not going to make it. So they concentrate all your bees, and then that attracts their predators and parasites. They have to be maintained. The bee houses have to be maintained. They concentrate disease. Native plants spread the bees out in the landscape, and they're less likely to encounter these types of problems. So leaving up the stems, leaving the seed heads, leaving the bunch grasses, leaving bare earth gives your bees a better chance. Okay, step 6, leaving the leaves. And now we've all been taught that you're supposed to rake up your leaves and put them in a bag and put them on the curb and send them to the landfill. It's a problem. So 70 species of moth, caterpillar eat dead leaves, fungi, and lichen. They need to be under leaves on the forest floor, eating that, breaking it down, and then they pupate under that, and they emerge from that litter in the spring. If you rake it all up, you're sending 70 species of moth to the landfill. So you want to leave the leaves. Many moths and butterflies overwinter as adults or as chrysalises in leaves or the soil. And some of you have probably found these in your garden before. These giant hawk moth chrysalises. They're in the dirt. They actually burrow down into the dirt and they pupate there. Mourning cloaks overwinter, and luna moths overwinter as adults in the mourning cloaks do in the leaf litter. So you need to just leave it in place if possible. If you want to rake it off your lawn and into underneath your bushes, that's fine. Put it there and let the little critters find the leaves there. Thousands of species of native flies breed in decaying vegetation. And people go, ew, flies, I don't want flies. Well, you got to wait a minute. These are black soldier fly larvae, and they will take care of your composting needs faster than red wiggler worms. These are better for making compost, and they provide amazing food for birds, salamanders, frogs, toads. This is what the adult looks like. It is not a biting or bothersome fly. It looks kind of like a wasp, but it's a beautiful long black fly. It lives for just a short while to lay its eggs, and then it dies after it emerges from this creepy looking larval stage. They're really good guys, so leave the leaves. Fly larvae are critical nutritious food for many animals. Winter birds hunt in that leaf litter for food. They need to be able to find these things and eat them. They're full of fat, they're full of protein. This is a long-legged fly. It is a predatory fly. It feeds on fungus gnats and aphids and thrips, the things you don't want eating your vegetables. I have these little guys all over my garden. They are so cute, and they are good guys, and they overwinter in leaf litter. Leave the stems. This is a woodpecker. There's a gall on this stem. It's going to go in there and find the larva of the gall wasp that made that gall. This is an American goldfinch getting the thistle seeds out of the seed heads that were left in somebody's yard or are out in nature, right? This is how these birds forage in the winter. Leave the stems, leave the seed heads, leave the leaves, build a brush pile. Brush piles are great winter cover for all kinds of creatures that need protection from the elements, and they need a place to forage that the neighborhood cat is not going to get to them in. Plan for water, cover, nesting sites, and food. If you want breeding birds in your yard, build your cat a catio so it's not out there killing native birds. Cats are feral, and domestic cats are one of the worst predators of birds worldwide. In some countries in Europe, they've now been designated an invasive species because they're such a big problem. So water, cover, nesting sites, and food. And then step 7, turn out the lights. Leaving lights on at night confuses and exhausts nighttime pollinators like moths. It also attracts birds into window glass. And so if you can change your outdoor lights to use motion sensor lights in your yard and on your driveways, or install yellow LED lights. Yellow lights are less attractive than these blue type lights that pull the insects up. All of these insects are going to kill themselves banging up against these lights. As Doug Tallamy says, you'd be surprised. You think you have to have the neighborhood lit because the bad man is coming. And he goes, you put the motion sensor lights in and kind of watch out the window and see how often the bad man actually comes. It's not very often. And you can protect nature by turning those lights off or making them only come on when somebody's walking up your driveway. Okay. So we can save nature only if we learn to live with nature. We have to not be freaked out by the insects that are around us, and make America native again. There you go. I will make this presentation available if you want to send me an email at this email address. I can send you in 2 portions a copy of the slideshow itself, and also the 2 PDF handouts that I would normally be giving to viewers of the slideshow.